Hello, I'm Joshua Harris, and I am here with CJ Mahaney. We just want to have a conversation and talk about some of the things that God is doing in Sovereign Grace Ministries. And I want to begin by saying that we did not plan on wearing the exact same outfit.
Yeah,
That was
that's how I was going to begin as well. I was going to say, how long before people notice that we are dressed exactly the same?
We're really not real professional with these things. We just happen to show up and we're both wearing the same exact thing. Although this could be an example of how I try to model myself after you in many different ways, and now even with clothing. So here we are. I want to just talk about the significance of where we are. The fact that we are at the conference in the very area that we have New Attitude. All these seats behind us have been filled with about 3,500 singles, young adults from all over the country, 450 different churches represented. Why do you care about an event like this for singles? Why is it important to what Sovereign Grace is about?
At this event, it is obvious the gospel is being effectively transferred to the next generation. So when I think back to my early 20s, when I begin praying for a future I didn't know if I would even be alive to see, but already in my early 20s, praying that whatever we did, whatever we were able to build at that time would serve the next generation. To now fast forward to this conference and to look out at the fulfillment of those prayers, this expression of the faithfulness of God.
To see God bringing those young adults, those children in many ways that you prayed for.
This conference is really like no other conference in that regard. And yes, these are the children of those who started out in Covenant Life Church, who originated, in effect, Sovereign Grace Ministries. These are their kids. So when I think of being entrusted with their kids and seeing their kids entrusted with the gospel, it is humbling. It moves me to tears. It brings me a unique and distinct joy. I do feel like the richest man in the world because I have the privilege to be here and witness what is taking place here.
If someone just came to you and said, "What's Sovereign Grace all about?" how would you answer that question?
I would say Sovereign Grace exists to advance the gospel through church planting. And Sovereign Grace exists to care for and train pastors of local churches. So those would be two passions and priorities in Sovereign Grace and two reasons why Sovereign Grace exists. We want to plant churches. We want to advance the gospel through planting churches. And we exist to care for pastors. We believe pastors are doing the most important work, the most difficult work, and we exist to serve and support them in every possible way we can because we have the deepest respect for those men. We have the deepest respect for them, and we have a conviction that they are doing the most important work, and therefore we exist to serve them. Local churches don't exist for Sovereign Grace. Sovereign Grace exists to serve local churches.
I talked to a guy recently who's been in Sovereign Grace for over 20 years, and he was just expressing how excited he is to see how God is positioning us to be at a place to do more church planting, to care for more churches. And he heard you talk about some of the changes that are taking place in the structure of Sovereign Grace to allow that. What is God doing? What are some of those changes about that can enable us to serve more churches?
2 years ago, it became obvious with the present structure that we were not able to effectively serve or maintain our service of churches that existed within Sovereign Grace, much less continue to church plant and respond to the many inquiries that we were receiving, as well as opportunities to church plant.
This is where churches are saying, we want to join Sovereign Grace. How do we become a part of this? That kind of thing.
Yes, it is a challenging time to know what we're to do and how we can deploy our limited resources to serve as broadly as possible, not only in this country, but we find ourselves now serving in 23 countries around the world. So this is not, I assure you, the fruit of human planning or human leadership. No one is more perplexed than I am, than we are at the leadership level at all that has taken place in and through Sovereign Grace. It is a privilege to serve, and it is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes.
The specifics of the changes really just relate to involving more men in that apostolic team, so that pastors can get that direct care and support. Talk about just the sense that it does seem like God has positioned us to send out more men in church planting. And what do you think is special about this moment?
Well, I think the changes we've been able to make, the men we've been able to add, so that regions have been created that are much more manageable across the country, is already making a difference. We have now more men deployed and positioned in order to serve local pastors who are geographically closer to those local pastors, and therefore I think ultimately more effective in serving those local pastors and in creating regional identities which will not only care for existing pastors and churches, but this structure will be conducive to adding churches. This structure, I think, will be conducive to accelerated church planting as well as additional churches through adoption. So I think, by God's grace, we are positioned to effectively care for all who are presently a part of Sovereign Grace, but as important, we are more effectively, I think, positioned to advance the gospel through accelerated church planting in and through Sovereign Grace.
Wonderful. Talk to the member of a Sovereign Grace church who hears all this, hears about church planting, hears about the pastor's college and international work and those kinds of things, and loves it, but just sort of feels like, how can I really be a part of that? I'm just a member of a local church. I'm just in my care group. I'm just trying to reach my neighbor and all those things. I know you have such a heart to help that person see the connection between what they're doing and the bigger mission of Sovereign Grace. What would you say to them?
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk to that person, because that's exactly the person I would want to talk to. I would want to talk to that person. I would want to meet with that person individually so that I could look that person in the eye and communicate how grateful I am to that person for the difference they are making in their local church, because it is their faithful, joyful service, their service in that local church, their support of their pastor or pastoral team in that local church, that makes all the difference in and through Sovereign Grace. And if we didn't have that integrity in the local church level, we wouldn't be expanding, we shouldn't be expanding, and we couldn't be expanding. So that is some of what I would want to say to that individual, but there's no way in this brief video you could possibly capture all of what I would want to say to that individual.
How do you think about the mission of Sovereign Grace, just even as your own home? I know that you give to the mission of Sovereign Grace because you believe in it. How do you think about that, and what do you say to the folks who have been consistently doing that? What would you want to communicate to them?
The first thing I want to say is thanks. The contribution of the average member, and there are no average members. When I think of the average member of a Sovereign Grace church, I think of true greatness as embodied in humility and servanthood. But their contribution to Sovereign Grace through their service in the local church, their support of their pastor and pastoral team in the context of the local church, their prayers for us, their support of Sovereign Grace in the form of intercession, and then add to that their financial gifts. I mean, how humbling is all of that? So the first thing, if I'm ever asked about investing in Sovereign Grace, the first thing I will do is say to that individual, thank you for the investment you have already made, and I would want to do all I could to convince them of my gratefulness and how deeply and profoundly affected I am by the contributions they have made in these various forms to Sovereign Grace before I transition to, in any way, appeal for their investment in the advance of the gospel through church planting. So I will never feel completely satisfied that I have adequately and effectively communicated my gratefulness, but I will continue to make the attempts, and at some point then I would want to transition and say, we are humbled by your gifts. They communicate trust. We take that trust seriously. And we do obviously have limitations, and their financial investment in Sovereign Grace makes all the difference in the difficult decisions we have to make about advancing the gospel, about a particular church planting, about a particular individual, a particular man, his family coming to the pastor's college, about whether or not we adopt a church. All of those decisions are ultimately related to the generosity of individuals within Sovereign Grace. And because those individuals within Sovereign Grace have been so generous, we have been able to make decision after decision, which has made a difference in the advance of the gospel, in somebody attending the pastor's college and then being deployed in a church planting, adopting a church. So my hope would be that the members of Sovereign Grace churches, having become aware of all that has happened, the expansion that has taken place, would get the connection between their example at the local church level, their giving, and all that has taken place, and by God's grace, only be more inspired to give more, so that by God's grace, we can do more in proclaiming the gospel of Christ and Him crucified, in planting more churches, in transferring the gospel to the next generation, all for the glory of God.
Amen.